David has very effectively led up to the what we have called the second sacred school. His emphasis is noteworthy on those who carried through very difficult times. There were instances where it looked like the population of the earth that was it. But there were those who had remained true to the Lord. And this is a vital aspect of this whole story, because here we are. I'm to share with you something of the New Testament. I will refer to the greatest one. There was enough substance established in the earth through the ages to enable the greatest one to come and take human form in the world exactly the way it is and maintain that divine identity. Now, there were many, as we've noted, who carried through with substance, but here was a unique example of something that never wavered, that never compromised. And these were difficult circumstances into which he came. I think somewhere underneath, particularly maybe religious people, nothing against religious people, that somehow Jesus moved through life with special privileges. Really? That he was recognized as special, made way for him. No. He was born into a people who were persecuted. We can see that in the world today. I would mention that there was a stigma attached to an illegitimate person that is not present today. Well, what stigma is present today? Anyway, he went through all this, maintaining absolutely his divine identity. At his birth, there were a few who knew of his coming. This indicates that something was present on the face of the planet. There is a mention of wise men. They were wise. And they're often called kings. They were wealthy people. These were aware of his coming because of a star which they followed. There are, I think, many people who perhaps see the star, but it needs to be followed if one is going to find the Christ. And remember that the Christ always is representative of this angel. That was one end of the social spectrum. The highest, wealth and position and nobility. The other end were the shepherds. No money. They lived in the fields and kept animals. The other end of the spectrum, but they saw and knew the sign. They didn't call it a star, they called it an angel. In the Bible, an angel represents light. I'm not saying it couldn't be a being, but it is light, as was a star. And I like this fact that they seemed to be different ways of coming. There are different ways, but they must be followed. There must be a steadfast attunement with that to find the source. They came to the same place. There's an interesting observation with respect to the angel, the shepherds. when they saw the angel, the minute there was that identification and recognition of the angel, suddenly there was with the angel a multitude of the heavenly host. Here's the connection with all of the cosmos, all the power in the cosmos. Once we have that identity of the angel, it's all connected. I think there's a subconscious idea that the cosmos is out there somewhere, out there somewhere. Well, what are we in? This is the cosmos. I am a part of the cosmos. And here it is saying it was all related. And it happens. It isn't always put off for next week or next year. It'll be better. Suddenly, at some point, suddenly, it's done. And why not now? The heavenly host on earth, yes, in human form, but the heavenly host in all the realms. And the veil, in my estimation, has become very thin. We know we're working with masters. Not that they aren't around us. They've been all the way through the history, as David brought out, magnificent response. Or the master could not have come. I'd love to read all the words he said. They're the wonder of the New Testament. And of course, there's no time for that. I haven't allotted time. The first recorded words in the Bible of Jesus are at the magnificent expression through him at 12 years old. And to me, this indicates the true design for God's creation. We feel you have to live, 21 years. Some people live forever, before maturity. It takes different ages. It's all right as long as we get there. But at 12 years, Jesus found himself in the temple with the learned men, doctors. That doesn't mean they were all medical doctors. They were doctors of science, of psychology, of everything. And one can imagine his joy in hearing all this, the history, everything. And the wisdom came through him. And one can just sense when, in any situation, the wisdom through him would put the climax to it all, or the meaning in all of this wonderful learning. And these learned men were astonished and kept him there for quite a while. So when his parents came for him, they said, "How could you do this to us?" And that's understandable. And what did Jesus say? "Oh, you don't understand?" Well, in a way he did. He said, "Wist ye not, don't you know that I must be about my Father's business? Don't you know you must be?" But he went home with them, and it is said he was subject to them, which means he was truly wise and fit himself into the pattern where he found himself. And the close of that particular chapter is that he grew in grace and stature, but in favor with God and man. That says a lot. Not just in favor with God. You know, there are some who think if you're in favor with God, you've got to be against everybody. He grew in favor with God and man. And it was proven in his ministry, the magnetism of his being, which drew everyone to him, men, women, children. Love was his message. Now there's a hiatus here. And people have tried to find out what Jesus did in that time between 12 years and something like 30. I think that's very wise, that gap. Some say they know, but they don't, because this is the way it should be. If all his movements were known every day and every week, wouldn't there be some who would say, well, if I do all those things? No. The way doesn't matter as long as it is in that direction and coming to the Lord. So it's left open wisely. The next reference is at the time of his ministry. After his baptism, he met the devil, it is said. But in that same text where it speaks of the devil, he is also called the tempter. That's a very accurate term. Who has never been tempted by anything? The tempter. And we have his magnificent answers on each of these three planes. The first, of course, the physical. And then the mental. The third, the spiritual expression, was the crux, where he told devil where he could go. Of course, that's where he lives anyway. That temptation was exactly the same which Judas presented to Jesus, which resulted in Jesus being in Gethsemane. The very same temptation. Here is the whether this meeting of the tempter was with a person, we don't know, and it doesn't matter. But it was all met by Jesus. Here was something in the mental level which said there was a recognition of the power of Jesus, absolutely. And it was saying, with your power and your magnificent mind, you can have all the wealth in the world. Well, that temptation hasn't disappeared. Hasn't been denied very much either. But this was what Judas was presenting to Jesus. He believed in his power, definitely. He believed in the magnificence of his mind. And he said, all the kingdoms of this world belong to the king. Let's do it. Let's get them. You can do it. Oh, he believed in his power. If his intention was that Jesus would die, he never would have gone out and committed suicide. He'd have rejoiced. That was not the way it was supposed to happen. And he was the treasurer. He saw kingdoms. Anyway, that was met early in Jesus' life. In fact, the first reference we have after his baptism. The magnificent victory in Gethsemane on the cross, and he came to show that the way which man had chosen was completely opposite from that which the Lord intended. Remember, the angel's song was, "Glory to God in the highest and peace on earth, goodwill toward men." God's will is goodwill toward men. Elsewhere it says that the Lord is not willing that any should perish. He isn't decreeing the death of anybody, although this is what man has attributed. And you can hear people say, why is God doing this to us now? God didn't pollute the atmosphere. He didn't do any of that. So it brings us through his experience which is something that must be held in the face of, I would say, a dominant opinion on the face of the earth through human beings, that death is the will of God. There's nothing wrong with death in the fallen state. What would happen without it? It is a blessing. This is the fallen state. It is a complete change of man's state. But that decree is life. And Jesus proved that on the cross, and in the tomb. It was a womb rather than a tomb. And on the cross he delivered his capacities into the hands of the Lord, his subconscious capacities. He said, "Into thy hands I commend my spirit." But it was his action doing it. He was in control. And then we know the story of the light in the tomb and his coming forth and the wonder of his whole life from beginning to that last. And there were other characters in the New Testament. I'm not going to worry about those characters myself. But and there has been addition of verses throughout the Bible, not just the New Testament, when it was compiled, put in by different ones, a few verses attributed to Jesus, which are not. Definitely not his, but they're very easy to see. They jump out at you. But the wonderful words which he brought, and his magnificent life, wonderful life. So, where does that bring us? How does that connect with where we are now, the life of Jesus? Well, to make a connection, I go to the 15th chapter of John. Now, when the days when I was new in the ministry, and not so new, but most of my life in this ministry, those on the mailing list when Yolanda was here were told to memorize the 15th chapter of John. I couldn't repeat it now, but I could at one time. But I mention that because it emphasizes the importance of this piece. And I'm going to read a bit of it now. Does anybody know which one it is? That's right. I am the true vine, not I am the vine. There's a big vine on the face of the earth, a huge body, but I am the true vine. And my Father is the husbandman. That says it, doesn't it? This is where we are. This is his body on earth now. I am the true vine, and he led the way for this vine. And it's a perfect symbol. Essentially, it's the same as the tree of life. The tree of life has branches, but a vine does something special. I am the true vine. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. And every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. So we rejoice in the purging, don't we? I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit. For without me ye can do nothing. This is the life of the whole body of mankind. We're speaking of the focus of that body. Everything has a focus. And the love that comes through him, this is what he always emphasized. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. Well, we're talking about a time. This has always happened, but this is a very special time. But it doesn't say that he does anything to judge which branch will be burned and which will abide. Simply, those who abide in me belong to the body. And there is much that has gone wrong. It's obvious. And he says that will be separated. It will separate itself and be withered and then burned in the fire. But it is self-destruction. It is not God's will, but God's will is to let this mess be cleaned. It has to be. Or the earth will not survive. If ye abide in me, and my words abide in you, ye shall ask what ye will, and it shall be done unto you. Herein is the Father glorified, that ye bear much fruit. This is my commandment, that ye love one another, as I have loved you. As he has loved us, and that is without discrimination. It is the shining of the sun. And each, that which receives the light of the sun decides in itself, it's whether it will be burned in the fire or whether the fire of love will draw it unto itself. It's all the fire of love. At this point, I will go back to one of the great ones in the Old Testament, closer to the New Testament, but I'm going to mention Isaiah. He was a mighty prophet. He didn't have a lot to do with the history as it was being told, but a prophet. And he was one who recognized that upcoming was a new heaven and a new earth, and he delineated in exactly those words. But I want to read something he said, which applies to this time. He is, what should we say, quoting God. As we know, there has been that all through the book where God said this. Well, Jehovah was saying this, and that means the body of God expressing through human beings. Now will I sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved touching his vineyard. My well-beloved, in other words, the Lord, Jehovah speaking, hath a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. How better could this earth be described than a very fruitful hill? It is fruitful. It'll bring forth anyone it wants to bring forth. But here are some of the most poignant words ever uttered. What could have been done? Let's go back to that verse. He fenced it, he gathered it in, he did everything. He made a wine press therein so that the fruit of the vine could be made into the wine of life, our purpose. And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. And here is the poignancy. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes. Here we have an insight into the wonderful heart of God. What could I have done more? How could man have been created any other way except free choice? Not an automaton. That's not what image and likeness of God. So it is for us to exercise that free will and let the words of the Lord, thy will, O Lord, be done, not mine. But this is a beautiful passage. Wild grapes came forth. Wild is that which is out from under control. The control of the Spirit of God. Wild. You can take a beautiful rose bush, and if it goes, what they say goes wild, something from the root, it'll bear a lot of little flowers, but not that beautiful creation. The design is not there. So, I close on that note. We say the law works. It does. And we can see the futility of man-made laws. I'm thinking particularly now of one they're trying to pass to do away with hate crimes. Man cannot make a law to do away with hate. But there is a law that works. Absolutely. It is the law of love. And that governs this vine. We have no business saying that vine doesn't, or that branch doesn't belong. This one does. How wonderful. There's a diversity in the branches which makes it what it is. In fact, each human being is a branch and completely different. These are meant to abide together under the one law, and that body works. And the law is love, as Jesus brought. It seems that love, the two great commandments, love the Lord and then you love everybody. You'd think that was the simplest thing in the world, to say love. Sometimes it seems to be the most difficult. How utterly ridiculous. This is the commandment. Let the Lord decide, let love decide, but let's not hold back what and who we are.
Thank you, Grace, for the magnificent delivery of the Spirit of our Lord. We do have the opportunity to return the true grapes to the Lord. And through all the cycles of history that we have already touched and coming into this century, the opportunity has been just that, alone, to return to the Lord, the true grapes. What is strong with me in this moment is the hearts of Yolanda and Martin, hovering in this room in this very hour as we share this time together. In their work and endeavor to bring back to the Lord the good fruits. And we have the responsibility to continue that work. And how could we not finish it? So I have the privilege to touch briefly on the opportunity that was refocused of our master's work through Yolanda here in this century. We speak of it as a third sacred school. An opportunity that has proceeded rapidly in a matter of a few decades. Seeing many cycles of tremendous generation as well as cycles of heartache. as we have touched in this story so far through Grace and David, there has always been one priority on God's agenda for 20,000 years on this earth. And that was to establish a priesthood that would grow sufficiently in stature, strength, and in full spectrum to allow the substance of response in the earth to come to focus sufficiently. There was a priesthood at the time of the motherland, at the time of Atlantis, something that continued on from Lemuria. A priesthood that began again with Abraham in that time 4,000 years ago and developed over hundreds of years. And then a priesthood again that began to form around the expression of the Master, the 12 disciples. Through each of these priesthoods, both victories as well as failures were experienced. Where there were failures, the next cycle of proving out of a priesthood that comes along, that new priesthood has to reverse the pattern of failure that had existed before and establish a victory in that. And the new emergence has the victory of each of the priesthoods that have gone before to draw strength and reservoir of substance from. And we have that available. In speaking about these priesthoods, because priesthoods have gone through various cycles of corruption on earth, the word priesthood is not always connected to a memory of reality at a subconscious level. So we need to recognize that there has been a great deal of experience of corrupt priesthood on earth. But the opportunity is to establish the true vine and the priesthood that provides the core for that true vine. Maybe to say briefly also that in each of these cycles, where there was the calling forth of a true priesthood on earth, there were other concurrent patterns of emergence in the earth. At the time of the first sacred school, it was present in the East, in India, through what emerged through Krishna, and later became Hinduism as it began to devolve. Again, at the time of the Master, there were concurrent cycles surrounding the emergence of the Master on earth. In other parts of the world, a cycle of a few hundred years of extraordinary emergence of leaders throughout the world. We don't have time to go into that, but just to note that. And in this cycle too, a preeminent focus emerged through Uranda to allow a breakthrough sufficient into divine memory to bring forth what needed to be brought forth. But concurrent cycles with leader capacity angels incarnated into various cultures and locations on earth, preparing the path for one emergence. It is just one body. People have at times thought the Third Sacred School was, or even EDL was, this little organization of some sort. No, the emissaries of divine light are the incarnation and the emergence of each of these foci of light. I want to rapidly move through the emergence of the emissaries of divine light in this century. So tighten your seatbelts. This is a history that for some we haven't reviewed lately much. But it is a history of God emerging, Jehovah emerging, with vital focus and magnificence of substance and stature. 1932, Yuranda had his awakening. 4 days in which much emerged. All of you are familiar with that, so we won't go into that. 1940, Yuranda met Martin with grace. A monumental moment in time and history where two great beings met. Yuranda at this point yet awakening, yet emerging, but the process increased rapidly through that awakening, through that meeting. 1945, Sunrise Ranch was bought, and the beginning of a physical location where the holy place could be embodied on earth. 1947, Martin reached a point of it's not Martin, it's the Lord being in Martin emerged sufficiently into the consciousness of Martin that they were one. And Martin was ordained by Yuranda as bishop at that point. A recognition of a vibrational event that had taken place in Martin. 1948, 100 Mile House unit was established. 1960, Bill Bain appeared on the scene. Another great being come to work together with the two that had emerged already. So moving on quickly, 1963, Green Pastures is established. Now, 1972, Kingview community. 1973, now in rapid succession, these were established. You can see how something is established and grows in depth, in root, and strength over time with not that much visible expansion and fruit. So if we find ourselves in any point in the cycle where we want to shout for expansion, and it doesn't seem to be happening, it's possible that something of root is taking place so that a future expansion can happen. So 100 Mile House and Sunrise for a long period were alone present, and it took, looks like, 15 years before the next community emerged, Green Pastures. And then 72, Kingview, 73, Edenville, 73, Oakwood, 76, Still Meadow, 77, Glen Ivy, 79, Hilliard Park, 80, Mickleton, so on. You could say rapid emergence of the branches of the vine. A notable event was 1981 Human Unity Conference, where something of enough generation internally had taken place in the body for the word to begin to be spoken externally. 1982 was the Emissary International Congress. 1985, the Rising Tide of Change events. 1986, Laveen was established. Same year, the pavilion was established, was built. Going on, 1988, Martin's passing. 1990, the establishing of 7 Riviera. Now, through all this history, for the most part, we are aware of the wonderful things that emerged and the strength that grew, but they were not without crisis, as Grace has pointed out before. There were a number of critical junctures where it was as though the ministry could have been finished. Yuranda spoke of it being as though he had to begin anew from the ashes several times. You know the story about Yuranda working with horses? Because there wasn't sufficient response to work with. Well, that's a pretty serious situation, if you think about it. Have we at times felt like we needed to work with horses? I just want to touch on some of the difficult, challenging points that we went through with Yuranda's passing. That was a pretty challenging time. Many that were with Yuranda did not stay with Martin. 1963 was a challenging point in the ministry also. If you read the book, it's there. There's a service titled Crisis that might be worth reading at some point. But to indicate that there were very challenging junctures through that whole time, as we have in recent cycle found some challenging times. Now coming up to the present time, Martin's death in 1988, that was a little challenge. Michael and Nancy's separation, what year was that? 93? Thereabouts. And then Michael's resignation in 1996. Challenging times. But the point of mentioning this is that something has stayed. That's the whole point. So, there are many wonderful things happening out there, concurrent cycles, other groups, and we could be wowed and wooed by them. But without the focus of something continuing, I dare say I would be very concerned about the future of this planet. We have a situation, a task now, coming into the present time, of the necessity of rapidly regenerating the substance that can accommodate the holy place. And it's been appearing in our midst. Something has been happening through the steadfast and persevering generation of whole ranges of people in very different ways. Something has been maintained, and there is a tempo picking up now. And by golly, it couldn't be any sooner. We are coming into a time where much of rising response as well as disintegration is looming in the earth. And the presence of an established and continually generating core of a holy place, I would say, is essential for the future of the planet. There was a story going back to the first sacred school, when Joshua was leading the children of Israel across the river Jordan, and the priesthood stood in the middle of the river Jordan with the Ark of the Covenant, while the encampment crossed over. And they stood in the midst of the river Jordan, holding back the wall of water. The riverbed was dry. You can go back to and kind of read up on the story again. The riverbed was dry. The water was blocked upstream. And the priesthood was holding the ark in the middle of the riverbed, you could say vibrationally holding the water, while all the encampment could cross. I would say that that is the role of the priesthood in the earth today. The strength of the holy place holds back whatever needs to be held back until enough of the encampment, enough of the men and women of integrity who form the encampment in the earth can pass over into a new state. So that was a rapid race through this century. So much more we could touch on, and all the wonderful allies that we have in the earth to work with. But we are entrusted with a particular responsibility of regeneration of a caliber and level of substance that very few have an understanding of, and thus the means to generate. So it's great to bring the spiritual legacy and history of the generations of all the true priesthoods on earth to this point, and vibrationally state in ourselves that we will do our job. We will see mankind through the passage.